So good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here, so to speak, for this Cambria Talks trade debate. Some early in the morning here in Europe, some late in the evening. We have some people from the Antipodes attending. My name is Andrea Tognoni, and I lead the trade practice at Cambria Associates. I'm delighted to introduce this great panel who will guide us through this topical moment for trade. A few years back, something that was the domain of only a few experts, and now is making daily headlines, especially in the COVID situation. Our speakers hardly need an introduction, I'm sure, but still, we have with us Michelle Asimakopoulou, former lawyer in New York, economist, former local politician in Greece, European Commission consultant, much more. Now an MEP for the EPP group and vice chair of the INTA committee. Ms. Shada Islam, director of policy at Friends of Europe, visiting professor, College of Europe, and so much more that we would run out of time just mentioning it all. Peter Sandler, director of policy coordination of DG Trade, where in the last 15 years, I reckon he saw the EU and even the European communities navigate enough crises to be in charge of dealing with the impact of COVID. Luisa Santos, Deputy Director General and responsible for international relations at BusinessEurope, representing the very tissue of which the EU is made. And last but most definitely not least, our moderator, Joanna Sopinska, Senior Trade Correspondent at MLex, who will have the challenging task of steering what I'm sure will be a thought-provoking discussion. On behalf of Cambria, thank you for joining, and Joanna, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, for this short introduction. Indeed, we have 4 great experts on our panel today. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to also welcome all the viewers who watch us remotely. Please write down your questions in the chat window, and I will try to weave them into my conversation. Let me now briefly set the context of this discussion. There has been almost 3 months since the COVID-19 outbreak in Europe. We are now in a different place compared to mid-March, when we saw countries introducing lockdowns, closing borders, and imposing export restrictions to keep critical medical equipment and medicines for their own hospitals and citizens. What we face now are the severe economic consequences of these lockdowns and some social restrictions that may stay with us for quite a long time. The forecasts are rather gloomy. The WTO has estimated that global trade could decline by up to 32% this year. The International Monetary Fund has warned that the current turmoil could turn into the worst economic crisis since the Depression. So, Peter, let me start with you. The Commission has been monitoring the situation very closely. So my question is, are these pessimistic predictions that I've just mentioned indeed materializing?
Joanna, good morning. And first of all, thank you very much to Cambria for giving me the opportunity to participate. Indeed, I think the outlook for the moment is bleak. I think our own numbers in the Commission, for example, suggest that exports are going to be down between 11 and 15%. And the trade impacts building on the severe economic impact and of course the human crisis in all of this is quite challenging, to say the least. It's extraordinary times. We've seen a set of extraordinary measures being taken by different EU member states and by countries all over the world. And part of the challenge is looking to see, what becomes the new normal. As you say, we've moved through a first phase, a phase which challenged EU solidarity. We saw the measures being taken even inside the internal market, which was a cause of concern. But we're also seeing the EU stabilize. We've seen very significant and decisive action being taken in terms of the recovery plans which were set out last week. We've seen lots of cooperation and steps taken earlier in the crisis, like the green channels, for example, to keep trade flowing. I know colleagues of mine across DG Trade and in our delegation have been active with problems in other countries. trying to keep things moving. But part of the challenge is that the COVID crisis has accelerated problems which were already there in the trade system. This is the challenge to the multilateral system, a global rules-based system, the WTO, and the fact that the WTO was struggling to have an impact. I think we've seen that even more in the current crisis. The fact that there is the deconnection which is happening between China and the US, and perhaps a third factor, and maybe we'll discuss more, this is the move in any event that we saw in a number of take a more national view of what they want, almost in terms of a zero-sum game, whereas I think we see trade very much as part of the solution to help us out of the crisis.
Luisa, let me now turn to you. Could you tell us what is the situation on the ground, how the companies are coping with the crisis? Broken supply chains, lost export markets, and much smaller consumer demand, just to mention a few challenges that they face right now. We can't hear you, Luisa.
Sorry, I was muted. Good morning, everyone. I think we have short-term challenges and medium-term challenges. So the short-term challenges right now is, of course, ensuring that trade flows while we still have a lot of borders that are closed. This is very important. We have a lot of problems in logistics and transport, namely air freight, that are still very much preventing trade from flowing normally, for instance, between Europe and US. So this is still happening. We still have countries coming out of lockdown at different speeds. And of course, because economies are so integrated and supply chains are so integrated, this is still creating problems. But we believe this on the medium term would be solved. Now, what are the downsides going forward? Indeed, as Peter said, I mean, we have the risk of some of these measures that were taken as a response to COVID-19 stay. We saw this for the 2009 crisis. We hope we will not be seeing this for this crisis. And then I think, yes, the nationalism and protectionism is definitely a threat, but we also need to see this crisis as an opportunity. It has also shown that digital trade is very important. E-commerce allowed a lot of companies from keeping their business activity, for instance, the restaurants, small business that could sell online their products. And we also think this trend will continue in the future. I mean, we are now experiencing more and more with e-health or e-learning. So definitely these are areas where we think this crisis could be an opportunity. So I think the important aspect of all this is that we take this as a lesson also that we need more international cooperation. And I think initially the reaction was very much national, but I think immediately afterwards, countries realized that there is an important need to have international cooperation. So maybe this could be a strengthening also of multilateralism, even if some countries or the administration in some countries is still putting this in question. But I think we can use the crisis also as an opportunity, hopefully, also to promote further trade.
Speaking about the reactions, each country has been affected by the COVID-19 crisis in a different way. And Michelle, a question to you. What do you think about the EU's first reaction to the crisis? Was it timely and adequate to the situation on the ground?
Let's just say that the EU hasn't always been famous for its speed in reaction, but let's be fair. This was a big shock to everybody. The initial reaction from most countries was some type of protectionism. According to the WTO in April, 2 countries impose some kind of export restriction measure. We saw India doing this, and even the EU. I mean, its first response was, okay, let's try and protect the internal market and keep things going. So we had this green lane initiative, which was very helpful to make sure there's speed at the borders, even though there are, as Luisa says, still many, many problems. And I share her sense that we're not going to go back to normal or transition to this new normal as quickly as we would like. There's a lot to be done. So in response to this protectionism, even the EU took some, with the export authorizations, took some protectionist measures in order to protect the market, which the internal market, which now have been abandoned or terminated. So, and of course the EU is mounting a huge response financially to the ensuing Great Depression, which everybody is predicting, although, you know, I'd like to be more optimistic, but anywhere you look, you see very, very, very bleak, as you said, Joanna, predictions of gloom and doom following this all over the world. This being said, I think that the risks are clearly that we'll have, you know, protectionism and the populist rhetoric that it fuels, and the appeal that might have to citizens all over the world will probably increase. At the same time, we also have more of a risk of trade war type actions escalating. You see, okay, the US has already been doing this, but you see China is doing this now. I mean, it just slapped a tariff on barley because Australia wants to discuss whether it was transparent enough in giving data to the World Health Organization. The US yesterday said, okay, we're starting a 301 investigation again if you dare to put a digital tax to finance your recovery and resilience package. So there's a risk of that escalation. But there are two very great opportunities, in my opinion. And these are, and I've seen this in Greece, we've done leaps and bounds in digitizing, in the digital transformation of our country, because, and this is a huge opportunity for everybody, to really transition into the new industrial revolutionized world. And the second one is for Europe. Europe wants to become a stronger geopolitical player. Well, this is the time, through the lessons learned, to re-examine the balance that we need between our industrial strategy, our competition law, and our support for reform, for example, in the WTO, as bearers of this, you know, free trade, multinational, multilateral, rules-based system champions. So those are the opportunities, I think, John.
Thank you. Shada, a question to you. How these different types of national restrictions, this new normal, could affect global trade? Can we already identify the trends that may change the way Europe and other parts of the world would trade in the future?
Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you, Cambre, for inviting me to this discussion. So just to follow up on what we've heard, and then I'll answer your question as well, Joanna. So clearly the pandemic panic phase is now over, and everyone has noted how unpleasant that was, how selfish that was, but also how inevitable that was. And now what I'm really hoping for is a new and a bold conversation on trade, because we cannot have a sustained recovery without trade as the key driver of this recovery. I think that message has to be given very strongly by European leaders, but international leaders as well. And this conversation has to be at the level of the WTO, so all signatories of the WTO, but also here in Europe. And I think that is going to be very important, because we've heard some very, let's say, damaging and contradictory statements from some of our commissioners and some of our national policymakers as well. And I'd like there to be a consistent and coherent line which says that globalization is not dead. Trade is not a bad thing. Reshoring, repatriation cannot be done sort of like a blanket. It has to be done in a very careful way. It has to be sure that we're not turning into protectionism. So a lot of mixed messages have been going out from Brussels and other EU capitals, which I think we really need to straighten up now and send a strong message. Now, at the WTO level, there is an opportunity now because Azevedo, the current Director General, is leaving a year earlier. And I think we do need to really come up with and agree on a new Director General who has a consensus building power and can deal with the very detailed issues that have had to come up now. Let me give you three trends that I see emerging, which I think the EU and the European Commission and also the Parliament should keep in view when we look at this new world, the brave new world, post-pandemic world that is coming up. First of all, regionalism. And so I've been speaking over these last few weeks of lockdown to people in all parts of the world, experts everywhere. And I think the trend that we've already seen of regionalization, regional organizations, it's going to become even stronger because the recovery in many parts of the world is regional. Travel is first regional. That's true in Europe. That's true in Asia as well. And always intra-Asian trade, intra-European trade has always been very buoyant and stronger than, intra-continental trade. And I think that's going to become even more so. And more experts are talking about nearshoring rather than reshoring. So I think that's a trend that we will really need to keep in mind when we look at this world. And for the EU, Peter, if I may be so bold as to give you some pointers, if you like, that means that we have to up our game with regional organizations when it comes to trade. That means perhaps joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, something that I've been talking about for some years now. That means upping our game with ASEAN, finally getting the ASEAN free trade agreement off the ground, really talking, and of course Mercosur as well. So we as a regional organization ourselves, as Europeans, we have the power and the potency to do that. Now, also, if we talk about changing the rules, the recovery plan that you have referred to, all of you, brings back the state in a big way into the European fabric, industrial fabric, business fabric as well. So we've often complained, and rightly so, about Chinese state-owned enterprises, industrial subsidies, and all the rest of it, and how they disrupt rules. I think we have to take into account that in this new world that we're building, because we need recovery, we ourselves are going to be also changing the rules. So we need to rethink that as well. And finally, I've found some of the comments that have been coming from Phil Hogan, the EU Commissioner, etc., very, very, I say, reassuring, because he is talking about plurilateral deals. Now, more and more, it's very difficult. We're so different. Our state systems are so different. Our economies, our business development, all of that is so different. I think the idea that we can come together at the WTO, all agree and find consensus on certain things is going to be difficult. So that brings me to the question of e-commerce. And Luisa, you rightly said, we've discovered the power of digital even more than we knew before. We need, I think, to move towards a stronger plurilateral accord on e-commerce, which is now, as you know, lagging behind. But also, Hogan has talked about pharmaceutical. A consensus plurilateral, if you like, a code of conduct or whatever on issues to do with pharmaceuticals, because we realize now how important health is. And also we need to recognize the mobility element, something that India has been stressing for some time. The fact that we need perhaps easier visas for health experts, medical experts, doctors, nurses, because that's a common public good now. It's not just a national trend. So I'm hoping that some of these innovative ideas will come through, not just because we're talking to ourselves, that's important, but also that we engage very much, and I think Luisa talked about that, international cooperation. Let's start a bold new global conversation and then decide where we can work together as groups, big, small, or not, and where we can actually get a global consensus within the WTO. But let's find the right mechanism and the right person to head the WTO in the coming decades.
Thank you, Shada. You mentioned many important issues. We will go back to them later on. Now I have a question from the audience. It's to Peter. The question is, how has the COVID pandemic affected the EU's appetite for the FTAs with faraway countries?
I think we remain very committed to continuing to pursue ongoing negotiations and to deliver those which are in the pipeline, which are on the table of the Parliament at the moment. The reason, I think, is very much as Shada just mentioned, it's the need to connect the European Union into the areas where growth is going to be restarting, where economic activity is going to be restarting. It's going to be an asymmetrical exit from the current situation over a number of years. But I think the EU, with its network, I think we now have agreements in place with 71 countries and more, as I say, in the pipeline. We're well placed to build those connections through our agreements. And I think the other factor which is important is that the agreements we're trying to develop and that we have delivered are ones which are increasingly broad in their scope. So they're covering core trade issues, market access issues, but they're also introducing disciplines in important areas. And they're also increasingly, they've extended their scope to touch on other concerns which we shouldn't lose sight of in the current context, in terms of green growth, in terms of climate, in terms of labour rights, because those are also part of the popular expectations which are there about what the EU and what trade should be delivering. So I think in summary, we remain strongly committed to moving ahead with trade negotiations, and we believe that our partners are going to, by and large, be in a similar situation, because trade is a low budget way of helping to find an escape route over the coming years.
Yeah, I have actually another question to you.
Yeah.
The previous speakers spoke a lot about the need to make the EU supply chains more resilient. But this is not a new idea, actually. It has been with us for quite a long time. And the crisis simply exposed the old shortages in the EU system. So does the Commission have a strategy how to help European companies to change their current modus operandi and to better prepare for similar supply shocks in the future?
I think we're trying to develop a way forward. But of course, at the same time, as civil servants, as government officials, whether EU level or member states, we shouldn't be dictating to companies what their supply chains should look like. That's very much something which business needs to be aware of, and these need to be economically led choices that the businesses are taking. It has to make sense economically for them to adapt. I think many businesses will see in the current situation that having a diversity in their supply chains is actually something which is quite helpful. For some of the areas where we were most under pressure, like masks, for example, we've been able to respond by sourcing elsewhere around the world, but also by boosting production inside the European Union. Obviously, part of the response as well does have to come, though, through some of the ideas in terms of investment, the EU Invest, the new window, which is added to that in terms of investing in certain strategic sectors. But we're at the start of a process where we need to reflect, and we need to also talk to the people most involved, the businesses most involved. And they need to have a good picture of what their supply chains actually are. If one thing that I think everyone has been struck by is the difficulty of actually knowing what these integrated supply chains really mean in practice. And it's only by the blockage of one small component on ventilators in one country that you suddenly realize the whole of the manufacturing chain can be held up.
Yes, and this
something here, Joanna.
Yes, I have a question to you, directly to you. Almost the same, but with a slightly different angle. I wonder whether the European companies are prepared, are ready in terms of their financial and logistic capacity to make their supply chains more resilient? And what kind of environment do they need to bring their production back to Europe? Because there's a lot of talk about this as well.
Well, I think first, and Shada already mentioned this, and this is very important. I mean, it's not because governments take decisions or try to bring production back to Europe by decree that this is going to happen. The companies have a number of conditions that determine where they produce and how they produce. In some cases, I mean, if you are producing in China, it's because sometimes you need to serve the Chinese market. So this is not coming back to Europe for sure. The second thing I wanted to say is that it does depend a lot on the model of business that you have and the product you're producing. The question of nearshoring or reshoring is not new. I mean, the EU is utilizing already the neighborhood to produce. I mean, I come from a sector, textile and clothing, where we are basically producing in what we call the Pan-Euromed area, involving Northern Africa, involving Switzerland, involving the Balkans. So there are already these flexibilities that business is using for many, many years. So I think the important thing to say is that we should not find one solution for everything. The second point is we have production in Europe. Why are not people worried about keeping this production? Because that is currently, or should be currently, our biggest priority. We are facing a huge crisis. Many companies will probably disappear, will be out of business, and we need to ensure that those that will stay and need to prepare for a number of challenges, as many of you mentioned, less consumption, possible changes by introducing new regulation that will take us to the digital and greener transformation. So all these will be a lot of changes at the same time that companies will have to face. So you need to ensure that you have the right framework to make sure that these companies stay in Europe. And by the way, you know, taxing companies, as it's part of the recovery plan, some of the taxes will be paid by the same companies. So you need to think twice when you're thinking about recovering, that you are not overburdening the companies by new regulation or by taxes. And actually, when you're thinking about reshoring, you're actually, you know, preventing companies that are producing here to remain in Europe. So this is very important. Then the second thing I wanted to say is that, coming back to what Peter was saying and the question of free trade agreements, we need trades and we need to diversify markets. I mean, diversifying supply chains and diversifying markets. We need to diminish the risk exposure in many ways, both in terms of input as well as output. So we still need to have more markets. And of course, we need very much to make sure that the agreements we have are really known and are really used by companies. I think we will need to focus a lot on this to also make sure that we take full advantage of trade, especially now. So no solution or one solution that will fit every business model, but definitely I think what this crisis has shown is that there is a lot of complexity in global supply chains. We might have concentrated too much in one or two products in one or two countries, but this does not mean that now we're going to completely shift production to Europe or elsewhere, or we're going to completely shift the model of supply chains. My final remark would be on services, because we are talking about production, but we are forgetting that services are key, and they are, of course, connected to manufacturing. And services will be more and more important in the future. And the service provider can be in Africa, can be in South America, can be in Asia. So we also need to take this into account. It's not just the production, you have the services part that might not necessarily be in Europe, might be somewhere else. And we need to take all this into account when we are talking about new rules that could be, better for this new environment in terms of the trade and investments here.
Let me now turn to Anne-Michel. A question. I want to come back to the EU recovery plan, which was announced last week. How to use this money to help European companies regain their lost foreign markets and boost their exports. And I want to merge this question with a question from the audience, which is specifically about how to help small and medium companies to accelerate their conversion to e-commerce digitalization. And this is also a question to Luisa.
Okay, so first of all, let me just say that this is an ambitious package that's being proposed, and I certainly hope that the council will, will step up its game and rise to the occasion and approve it. Now, then the question then comes, how is this money being used? I think it's quite clear that the EU, and I agree, we shouldn't change our priorities. That means that digital and Green Deal continue to be sort of the main themes around which our recovery is going to be structured, just like our future was going to be guided by these two priorities. So that hasn't changed. So what do? The Commission has now been talking about open strategic autonomy. I was actually reading something that was criticizing that this has a little bit of something for everybody. Free trade, people who enjoy free trade have the openness, people who want a more robust and more pro-European approach have the autonomy, and the strategic can cover various sectors and various interests. I actually think that's a positive thing, because that's exactly what we need to do. We need to find balance between those three things. Now, personally, I would like the Parliament to have more of a voice in determining what strategic is. And I think that when Commissioner Bretton has announced these 14 strategic clusters, isn't that what they're called, Peter? I mean, then I think that we should have a say in that. And I think that industry should have a say. And I think that this is very crucial also in determining how this money will be spent. What sectors will it go to support in our new normal and our new way of approaching things. Now, clearly digital is critical. Clearly it's an opportunity. Clearly SMEs are the backbone of the economy. I don't have to, the usual SMEs are 99% or whatever it is of the companies in Europe. So if you don't make sure that this money gets to the SMEs, then you haven't done anything. And this, in fact, is a complex process. And I think it has basically three solutions. One is you have to earmark the funds for them. Two is you have to simplify the procedures. And three is you have to work with the banking sector in order to make sure that this money gets to them when it comes to guarantees. These are three things that I think are common themes across all of Europe. I certainly see them in my own country and hear them from companies in my own constituency. So to summarize, yes, it's very positive that Europe has decided to have a response which I believe has the main characteristics which we've been asking for, and that is that it's a massive response. It's targeted strategically based on the right priorities, and also it has this element of mutualization in dealing with a common threat and a common problem, which I think might actually, if we're lucky, create opportunities for us to emerge more united and more integrated in the future.
Luisa, the same question to you?
I think, well, I totally agree with Anne-Michel in terms of the money part, so the financial resources to companies. I will focus more on the rule part. I think, of course, companies, and especially small and medium-sized companies, need clear rules when it comes to digital commerce and e-commerce and digital trade. I think that we have seen as well an increase in cyber theft and cyber attacks because everyone was using the platforms, everyone was using the digital sphere. So it also creates a more compelling need for clear rules and good rules. And again, we are discussing this at WTO. What we are discussing now in terms of e-commerce is very limited in terms of scope. I think we should increase the scope of the discussions, introduce more sensitive topics, like the balance we need to do between the flow of data and privacy, because this, again, is a critical issue. I mean, when we're all discussing about, artificial intelligence, all these systems of tracing and making sure that they respect also privacy, I think all this area is an area where we are going to see a lot of developments. They also will impact trade. So I think we need to be ambitious also here, and from the European perspective, and now coming back to the European Union in particular, for instance, we believe that we need to be ambitious, more ambitious in the provisions that we have in the context of the free flow of data in our trade negotiations. So I think that we can do a better balance between privacy and free flow of data, and this could enable also the position of the EU when we are in these international negotiations. So I think all these crises will probably, hopefully, will prompt us to all be more ambitious and try to find some agreement at the international level. One area where I think the US is also very, very keen and very engaged.
Thank you. Shada, let me now turn to you. I want to go back to what you said at the beginning about the state intervention and the role of state aid in the recovery plan. It seems that we have a second Marshall Plan for Europe, but the other parts of the world are also taking action to rebuild their economies. Is there a risk that the world will enter in a global race, some sort of a battle over who can subsidize more, which in fact could lead to new trade distortions?
No, absolutely, there is a danger, and that's why I think we need to actually get together and have this conversation. And that's why I was saying it's important that we rewrite some of the rules, because this is not business as usual. We're not going back to the old way of doing things. Recovery plans are everywhere, and fiscal stimulus are being played everywhere almost in the world. So yes, we need that global conversation, and we need to do it in a very inclusive manner rather than us and them. And I think that has been one of the key complaints of many countries, India, China, Brazil, etc., that they need to be part of the conversation. And when you hear some EU officials saying Europe and America can be setting the rules in this new 21st century post-pandemic order, I roll my eyes in despair, because we should have learned the lesson by now that that's not the way the world is going to operate. And if we don't want the world to splinter further, then we need to be very careful about what we do. And countries are interested in Europe. So just coming back to what Luisa said, I think the EU has great normative power in areas like digital. And we should use it. We should use it wisely. And I really believe that wisdom going forward, inclusive wisdom, rather than looking only at friends in the future. I just want to come back to a couple of other things that I heard, which I think are very important. The EU and FTAs, and Peter, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a great appetite for FTAs with the European Union in many parts of the world, but you know how difficult to negotiate those FTAs is. And even once you've done and concluded, you still have many obstacles. It's an obstacle race, whether it's the Dutch Parliament coming forward and saying no to the Mercosur agreement, or whether it's the Walloon Parliament on Canada. So we need to also, I think in this new world where recovery and trade will go hand in hand, we have to, and then we talked about this later, we have to communicate very, very carefully to our citizens concerns of Europeans about jobs and where they're going to be. And you know, this idea that somehow you can impose labor standards or environmental standards and countries will fall in line, I think that's also a very old-fashioned approach and has shown itself to be absolutely self-defeating, because countries sign up. I know several that sign up, and then, you know, to try and reach those levels is a more, let's say, constructive approach. Now, second point, where is growth going to come from? We've all realized that we can spend less money, we travel less, we go out less to restaurants, we're buying fewer consumer goods. I mean, and if we're doing it online. So where is the demand going to come from? How will the services sector, which is absolutely in free fall, tourism, hotels, restaurants, where's that demand going to come from? I think we need to ask ourselves that question. And it's going to come from middle classes, could have come from middle classes in the emerging markets, but those classes are fragilized. The daily wage earners who were slowly going up the ladder, they're absolutely on their knees. So we need to think globally about where will this demand come from. It's not going to come from China either, because you've seen that China in its last National People's Congress has decided not to set a GDP growth target, and it's going to also focus on building its own jobs and providing livelihood. So let's take that into account. Where will people be purchasing? What will they be spending money on? And my final point would be really two things. The Green Deal, yes, Anna Michelle, absolutely important. But once again, let's do it in consultation, because already there is a great concern across the world that this Green Deal, its external implications will be protectionist. And that needs to be clarified. We need to talk, we need to explain, and we need to factor that in when we're coming up with our trade policies. And the same thing about, I agree with Luisa totally about, you know, we can't be self-sufficient in everything, and business should be the one doing it. Just like for COVID-19, we need to listen to the scientists rather than the politicians who are making things worse daily, right? The geopolitical games. In this conversation about over-reliance or self-sufficiency, we need to listen to the business. They're the ones who know what they're talking about. So I'll just end this remarks with this, but really Europe can play a big role in this new world, but it has to do so wisely and in consultation and in inclusive partnerships with others.
Yes, talking about consultation and inclusiveness, I want to talk about the EU policy making. The COVID-19 challenges have prompted the Commission to bring forward the review of the EU trade policy. The idea is to open the EU-wide consultations in the coming weeks to brainstorm about policy options and strategic goals. So it might be a good opportunity to as you said, Shada, to talk about the goals and how they should be achieved. Peter, a question to you. Could you briefly explain how this process could look like and what will be the focus of these consultations and how broad they will be?
Well, we are launching probably later this month a consultation exercise which will eventually lead in the autumn, probably mid-autumn, to a communication, a report which will draw conclusions from both the consultation and our assessment of where we are with trade policy now. The aim, I think, is to look at the issues around the multilateral system, globalization, the challenges to globalization. We've already touched on some of those. There, I agree very much with Shada's point that we have to look at ways in which we can re-energize the multilateral system and have policies which are seen as winning policies for everyone. If we look at the WTO, there are going to be a number of things we hopefully can achieve in the short term. I put e-commerce amongst those. I would put a possible health initiative to facilitate trade in health goods within those. But there's also the medium-term challenges, the structural challenges, where perhaps we have to look more for plurilateral solutions to problems at a global level as a starting point. There are the challenges in terms of the development agenda and making sure that the whole of the WTO membership can buy in to the agenda that the WTO is trying to pursue. That's things like special and differential treatment for developing countries. I think secondly, we're going to be looking at our trade agreements and the agenda we have for trade agreements. In particular, the coverage. There was a question, I think, in the chat about Africa, and we remain very strongly committed to supporting and working with Africa through trade as well, and looking at their own initiatives for a Pan-African free trade area. But we will also be focusing on trade in the context of the recovery. And this goes to some of the points which have been made about the balance between the immediate actions related to the crisis and coming out and dealing with the crisis so you reignite the economy at home, and hopefully in parallel discussions with the G20 and others doing similar things around the world. But seeing where the balance is eventually struck between what are these crisis measures and what is long-lasting changes in inflection or emphasis in policies. And we will also be looking at how trade interacts with the broader policy agendas, whether it's specific things like the Green Deal, like digitalization, or whether it is the broader set of issues on sustainability, on the impact of trade agreements on consumers, on managing precisely the challenges, the sorts of issues which haven't gone away with the crisis, which fuel the discussions in the Walloon Parliament, or the current discussion around CETA in the Dutch Parliament. We need to make sure then check that the policy direction we have is still relevant, and how we can adjust that. But at the heart, I think, is this strong commitment we have to multilateral solutions, and seeing how the EU can lead on those issues. There seem to be fewer voices calling for multilateralism, and I think we remain very strongly committed to that.
Thank you, Peter. Luisa, I want to turn to you now. As a business organization, what do you think are the weakest points of the current EU trade policy that urgently need to be addressed?
Well, I think I mentioned already one, and that is not necessarily only a EU weakness, and that has to do with communication about free trade agreements. I think the EU Commission, and particularly DG Trade, has done a lot in communicating about benefits of trade and what a specific trade agreement can do for a given country and a given company. So for me, the big challenge is that this message somehow, and is also our responsibility as business, is not going through at national level and regional level. And that's why you have so many people questioning these trade agreements. Look at the discussions now on CETA still ongoing in the Netherlands, while the Netherlands is one of the countries that is mostly benefiting from this agreement. So it's clear that we have to work more on the concrete benefits of trade, making trade more concrete. I think this is very important, making trade more concrete for a country, making it more concrete for the company, for the consumer, for the worker. And I think it's also the role of companies. When you are a big company, you need to explain to your employees exactly what trade is and how your company's future, your company's development, your company business depends on trade. And this sometimes is not done, but I think is necessary, because in the end, if you have indeed a social uproar against trade, we have a problem. We need, and this was already mentioned, we need to make sure that these agreements after being negotiated, are then ratified and implemented. And this is a growing concern. Also because we see that there's a lot of opposition to trade, but not necessarily, I mean, we have sometimes a group that is speaking very loud. It's not translating the majority, but is definitely setting the agenda in terms of the discussions about trade. So we need to bring the agenda back to the core essentials. Of course, trade agreements, and I want to make this very clear, are not only or should not only be about economic benefits. We agree that trade agreements could also be a tool and should be a tool to promote other policy areas, to increase the level of engagement on climate change. Definitely, we need so, also because if we are being asked more and more in Europe, it's also good that other partners on the rest of the world also step up to their efforts. And the same goes for social and labor standards. But the important thing, and I think that Shada already alluded to this, is that this should not be seen as Europe preaching the rest of the world what they should do. We also need to show to other countries that is in their benefit as well in this area. So I think we need to help them as well. We need, together with, saying, okay, let's set this goal. You're going to increase your commitments in terms of climate, but at the same time, we are, giving you the right technology. We are providing you with the right products. We are supporting you also from a training perspective to do so. Not references and you are cut out of our market. I mean, this is not the way that you build a sustainable change that actually is something that we will also like, because of course this also creates a more level playing field. So I think these are areas where we think we need to work better in the future.
Thank you, Luisa. Now I have a question to Anne-Michel. Trade Commissioner Phil Hogan said last week that the EU's trade defense measures were too weak to address the COVID-19 challenges. Do you agree with this diagnosis? Does Europe need to tighten its trade defense toolbox?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it needed to do that before the COVID-19 crisis, but certainly that this crisis has shown that it needs to do that. And I mean, everything that's going on in the world now, whether it's the trade wars, whether it's the attempt to decouple, whether it's the COVID-19 crisis, everything points to the fact that if the goal of Europe is to become more powerful geopolitically, it has limited firepower. Regulating is just, and the Brussels effect, as it's called, is a good tool. But yes, we need to strengthen our toolbox. In fact, we're discussing an intent. I'm the shadow rapporteur for this enforcement regulation, which we're now expanding to deal with a situation in the WTO and the blockage of the appellate body or similar type of things that could happen under bilateral or free trade agreements. And in this, we would like to, I think it was Luisa maybe who spoke about the services, and in this we're asking to expand our toolbox to cover in enforcement situations, to cover services, not just goods and IPR, which is very important, I think, and also to give the possibility to use provisional measures in cases where either our goal of strategic autonomy is not being achieved, so in specific strategic sectors, or when there's manifest or there's clear-cut injury that we need to address quickly in order to protect ourselves. I think that you cannot, if you launch empty threats, then you don't get any results. And I agree that we all together have to balance an exercise, which is one, reminding, I'm going to look at it from the point of view, obviously, of my constituency. So what politicians need to do, working with business and working with the Commission services, we need to people of the benefits of trade, so many benefits that they take for granted in their daily consumption patterns, or remind people of the relevance of trade to creating prosperity, to creating jobs, which is going to be at the top of the political agenda. Remind people also that yes, trade can be, aside from the economic benefits, trade can be a tool to export or to promote our values. Our values as Europe, that's what keeps us together, our common values. And in trading, we cannot just be hypocritical and ignore them when there's trading benefits from trading with a particular region, just let our values go out the window and then use our values only to find, let's say, political balance within our own little agenda in our own little bubble world. So in summary, and thanking you for giving me the opportunity to express my views, I think that it's quite clear that in my view, Europe should continue to be the defender of multilateralism, the defender of open trade, the defender of value-based trade, and use trade for those values. But we cannot forget that the basis of trade is prosperity. And this was the basis upon which the European Union was founded. And this is what citizens need to remember now more than ever. Now when basic things that we took for granted have been shaken to the core, now is the time to go back to the basics and remind them of our fundamental values that trade really promotes.
Thank you. Shada, let me go back to you now. Europe is also facing, we can't forget about it, a few major non-COVID related challenges. You mentioned dysfunctional WTO. We also have a very weak transatlantic trade relationship and the ever more aggressive China's trade policy. So my question is, talking about the EU trade policy in the future, does it need a cosmetic change or a total redirection to be able to address these challenges?
Thank you, Joanna. So it's from what I've said, I think you've understood that I don't think tinkering at the edges of global trade policy or EU trade policy is going to be enough in a very rapidly transformed world. And I think many of us are not traveling at the moment, but if we were to get onto planes and go to Beijing or Delhi or in Latin America, we would see how much things have changed there in terms of consumption patterns, in terms of how people are living their lives and their concerns at the moment. And I think amid all the panic and amid all the selfishness and the disinformation, etc., that we've seen during these rather difficult months, we've also seen a great deal of empathy and compassion and understanding among people. Solidarity on the global stage as well. So, you know, our politicians can rage and rant against globalization, but globalization, that someone has said, at the local level, globalization, solidarity across countries and societies and communities is very much alive. So I think the moment is appropriate for a change in narrative. And what I've just heard from Luisa and Anna Michelle really heartens me, is music to my ears, because I've been saying for years and years, really, that we need to bring a new narrative into our conversation on a new story about trade, which goes beyond the economic side of it, but also brings in the social side of it, brings in the female side of it, the gender side of it, because there's SMEs and other startups that we've talked about as being the backbone of our trading, global trading systems. Many of those are run by women. So we need to bring that element. And Cecilia Malmström did it. I think we're thankful for her to having done that. But we need to take that further. And also it's important when Peter talks about, and I'm reassured that we are going to be talking about multilateralism. So that means really including even I would say the voices of the Indias and the Chinas and the Brazils of this world. They may not agree with us on many points, but as I said, the rules are changing. We are changing the rules as well through our own state interventions in industrial subsidies, in in companies. Our competition rules are changing. So we have a moment where we can discuss openly about the changes that are happening. Now, business, I've been following trade first as a journalist and now as an analyst for almost 30 years. And one of the things I kept saying, and I think Peter Chase, if he's in here somewhere, knows I've said it very often, is business has been so silent about trade. In the WTO, it's heartening to see Business Europe now really standing up and talking about business and business interests and business commitment to multilateralism and to trade. And this story has to be told more publicly. My final point was really going to be, this is the moment to do what I call the Bretton Woods moment. This was towards the end of the Second World War, when people were, thinking already, wise leaders, not irresponsible ones like we have at the moment, many, were thinking already of how do you change, how do you bring peace and prosperity to the world. And if we stay in our little national corners and say, no, this is just our problem, or this is just a European problem, we don't have to worry about India, we don't have to worry about China, we don't have to think about what's happening in Brazil. This will not work, because the pandemic has illustrated so vividly how interconnected, interdependent we are. So I would urge, and as a European, I really believe that this is the moment Europe can show leadership, but it has to do so outside of its normal comfort zone. And that means talking to countries that are not like-minded, that are not so-called natural allies. But we're a part of one world, and we're going to need that one world if we're going to find a vaccine against COVID-19, but also if we're going to have a recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to wrap up here. I'd like to thank all the participants for their excellent comments, and the viewers for being with us today. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a nice day.
For attending.